Okay, we are going to move on with our next stitch on the sewing machine, which is going to be a French seam. This one is a little bit different than all the other seams that we've done so far, and even the ones that we'll continue doing in the way that we sew it. Okay, so I'm starting with my prepped 2 pieces of muslin that are 10 inches long, 4.5 inches wide. Okay, and I've got 2 of them, and I'm going to sew them together to make my seam. I've pressed them. They still look a little wrinkly. I'll keep pressing them, maybe hit them with some steam if I need to. But ultimately, they're not super wrinkly. They're straight. They're going to work for me. So what I'm going to do is to put the 2 pieces together, I'm going to kind of demonstrate that. Again, this one is a little different than any other seam, and it's hard to tell using muslin because our muslin looks exactly the same on this side as it does on this side. The front and back are very difficult to determine, and it only really matters because if you go to do this seam later on any other fabric that isn't the case, you'll run into issues. So I'm going to pretend this is real fabric. So, which means that there would be a front and a back that would be obvious. So I'm going to take just a marker and I'm going to pretend I've got a polka dot pattern on my fabric. Okay, so it's got a front and a back. So this is my pretty polka dots. And you can do this yourself just to remind you the way so that you can remember. The whole point of this sample book is that later you could look back at it and remember how to do these seams. So this is the front of my fabric, this is the back of my fabric, okay? This is the side I have the print on. So normally when we sew, we would put the 2 fronts together. We call that good to good. The good side is sewn to the good side, okay? Because then we would, and I'll pin it just to show you, we would sew. So I'm going to pin as though I'm pretending that I sewed this seam. So, right? And then we would open it up, and this would be, you know, the outside of our fabric, right? And our seam would be here, and our seam allowance, the fray side, would be in the back, right? But our outside would look really nice and pretty, and we wouldn't see our seam, okay? So with the French seam, this is the only one, like I said, that we're going to do that is different. We don't sew it good to good. We actually sew it to start bad to bad, the bad side to the bad side, or the back side to the back side, however you want to look at it. But I'm going to say bad to bad. So this is how we would set it up. We'd sew it so that we see the good side on both sides, okay? So I'm going to pin as normal, okay? So pin perpendicular. I'm going to sew on this long seam. So start a pin there on the edge, pin in the center, and a pin on the other edge, okay? So again, I'm going to sew it with my 2 undersides facing each other, a little bit different. The other thing that's different is I'm not going to start by sewing this at a 1/2 inch. With this seam, the inside seam allowance is enclosed upon itself. It's a really delicate, high-end couture seam finish. You'll see as I go. But so this seam, we're going to start by sewing at 1/4 inch, really close to this outside edge, so a little bit different, okay? And then we'll go from there. It'll still ultimately be a 1/2 inch seam allowance because you'll see what we'll do. We'll sew at 1/4 inch, we'll flip it, and then we'll sew again at another 1/4 inch. But don't get too carried away just yet. Okay, so I've got this pinned. We can go to the sewing machine now and start sewing this at our 1/4 inch. So I'll bring it up to the machine, and again, so my 1/4 inch is going to be right in line with my presser foot here. So I've about 1/4 from the edge. Start by putting my needle in, and because I'm about to hit that pin right away, I'll pick the presser foot back up and pull that out. And I'm going to walk these first few stitches holding on to the thread, okay, to really make sure that's set up nicely. And again, you can see, where's my fabric? It's right in line with my presser foot. I want to sew this first seam at 1/4 of an inch. And turn this on and use my foot pedal. Going nice and slow and controlled. I'm about to get to this other pin, so I'll put my needle down, presser foot up, take the needle out, or the pin out, sorry, put the needle back down, presser foot down, and I can sew the rest of the seam. Just gliding it along. About to hit that other pin, so needles down, presser foot up, I can pull the pin out, presser foot back down, and finish the seam. Okay, I'm sewn right off the edge. Walk that last stitch just to make sure it's complete. Presser foot up, pull gently, and trim that edge. Okay, so I've got this seam sewed. Again, I can just push any gathering that's happened right out with my hand. But you can see this is a lot closer to the edge than we've been sewing. It's 1/4 of an inch, okay? And I can clip this end here, maybe about 2 inches from the edge so it doesn't unravel right away on me. Okay, so we've got our 1/4 of an inch. And the next step that we're going to do is press this and get it ready to sew again. And so I'm opening it up, and what I typically do is press this in one direction. Okay, so I'm going to press all towards one side. What I might do first, just to make sure, because the ends might be fraying a little bit, is I usually trim this down with some very sharp scissors. So obviously I don't have a lot of room to work with, right? It's pretty close to the edge anyway, so I don't want to trim a lot, but I might want to just trim off some of this fray, right? So maybe about half of what I've got here, okay? Very carefully, and again with very, very sharp scissors. It's just going to be so much easier so that you're not sort of fighting it and you can get it really nice and crisp. So let me show you what I mean. So I lay it down flat, and I'm going to come with my scissors and trim about halfway, maybe not quite halfway from the edge. And this way I'm going to have a really nice crisp edge with no fray kind of bothering me in my way. And it sort of depends on your muslin sample and, you know, how much fray you've got going on. See, I'm going so slow. Really want to take your time with the preparation on this. So now I've got about like a fat 1/16 of an inch from the edge. Very, very close, but there's no fray, right? It looks really nice. I don't want to handle it too much at this point because it's easy to start making this fray again. So I'm being like super gentle with it, okay? But just like I said earlier, I'm going to press it open, and I'm going to press this little tiny baby flap seam allowance to one side. Pick a side, any side you want, whichever side it seems like it's already leaning towards, okay? So we'll come over to the iron and see if we can press that. So again, with this, it's so small, so it is really easy to lose a little fold of fabric in there, and we don't want that at all. So I'm really going to be pulling to make sure my fabric's taut the whole way. And I'm just going to, like I usually like to do, set this up, pull it apart, and I'm going to sort of finger press, just get the fabric ready, that seam allowance in one direction. And then to make sure that I don't sort of mess this up, I'm going to sort of swoop the iron to the side. See how I'm doing that? I'm like putting it down and sort of rubbing it to this side, okay? Before I just come in, and now I can sort of do that motion. But I'm really making sure by holding down this side and then pressing and sort of pushing it away that I'm keeping it open, okay? So then the moment of truth, I flip it over and just make sure that I haven't locked in any folds. And even I can see, watch how See, I pull that and I can see there's a slight, I mean, we're talking so subtle, but there are like, it's a slight little fold there, right? So my goal now when I press from this side is going to be to really open that back up as much as I can. I don't want to lose anything. This is such a tiny, delicate seam, so I really want to be careful. I might even, I'm like, which side is better? Now when I press, I know that my fold is kind of happening this way, so I'm really going to try to concentrate on pushing that open. I could hit it with some steam to kind of soften it up for me and really set that, but I've got it pressed as open as I can get it, okay? So I'll come back and look. That's looking pretty good. I mean, again, I can kind of pull, and I see the thread underneath, okay? But there's no, situation where I've got a good size fold of fabric, okay? Really nice and straight. And again, it looks like this, it's pressed to one side. Now my goal is to fold it directly in half. I want to fold it on this line, not close to the line, near the line. I am folding it on the seam line, okay? That's why I pressed it to one side a second ago, so that it is easier now to fold exactly on that seam line. Don't lose any. Don't let a fold happen or one side go more over than the other. I'm folding it exactly on that seam line, which shouldn't be too hard because it wants to fold on that line. And then I'm going to press it again. It's all about preparation with this stitch. Take your time and get it right. So press it, really press it. You can steam it. You don't want this to move on you. Okay, and what I'm looking for is that it is exactly folded on that line. If I look from this side, I don't see any of the previous side coming over. And same here. It is really folded right on that line, okay? So now I can sew it again. And you could pin this if you want to, if you feel like it's moving on you. You could stick a few pins in it. Usually because I've just pressed it so hard, I feel like it usually stays in place, so I don't need to. But again, if it feels like it's moving on you, do what you gotta do. So now I'm gonna sew this again in this long direction on top. So now look, I've got good to good, like we normally do, and I'm gonna sew it at 1/4 of an inch again. And my goal is to encapsulate the tiny seam allowance on the inside. Okay, maybe it'll make more sense once you see me do it. So what's going to happen is I'm going to sew right about here, 1/4 of an inch from the edge, making sure that you can kind of see, that tiny bit of seam allowance that's on the inside. I'm going to make sure that that's enclosed, okay? So that when I open up the seam like this, it'll look like this. You won't see, this will be enclosed on the inside. It's like awesome magic, okay? So I'm gonna sew it and then you'll see what I'm talking about. But I'm sewing this at 1/4 of an inch from this new edge, okay? And I'm really making sure that I stick to that. So I'm gonna put my presser foot down about 1/4 of an inch from that end there. Hold on to my threads, get my needle started. Okay, and I'm really going to keep this in line with the edge here. Turn on my machine, and again I'm going to sew it 1/4 inch all the way down using my foot pedal. Just gliding this along right in line with the end of the presser foot. Okay, go right off the edge. My needle's down, so I'll show you, I'm gonna walk it forward one more time. Pick my threads up, cut it, and see I've got this 1/4 of an edge new stitch sewn from the edge. Again, I will press all of my gathering and tension out. I can trim this about 1 or 2 inches. Okay, so I've got that 1/4 of an inch, and here's the moment of truth. Open it up, and this is now my outside seam. Notice how this looks just like we sew every time, right? You see this pretty seam, right? Nice and finished. This would be the outside of my fabric. Here's my polka dots. And then on the back, what have we got? We've got seam allowance, a little floaty bit, but it is completely void of fray. The fray is encapsulated inside. Okay, so we've sewn a little seam, flipped it, and then kind of tucked it in, you know, you see how that's happened? So this is a really lovely seam because on the inside of a delicate silk fabric, something sheer, something nice, a nice dress, you don't have any fray, you don't see anything. It makes it really nice and light and pretty. And to finish this off, so you don't just have this flappy guy, I usually, again, pick a side and press it all to one side. Okay, so I'll come over to the iron. And I'm going to, again, press this sort of open with my hands, really making sure I'm not getting any folds in there. And I'll pick one side and press it in that direction. Okay, and again, I'm kind of pulling, pushing, making sure that I'm not creating any folds. And then check it from the front to make sure that it looks nice and flat. And I just want to make sure, see how I've got like the most subtle fold. I feel like it's so hard to see on the camera. So when I press this now from the front, I'm just really going to make sure I almost see that pucker, okay? I don't want to lose any of my fabric. So I'm just going to press towards where I'm seeing that fold kind of happening. And again, I can hit it with some steam. That's a lot of thicknesses kind of shoved into that tiny space. So I want to make them obey me. But now you can see, I can see because it is, again, so many thicknesses. You can see that sort of dark line, but it looks really nice and flat from the front. And from this side also looks really nice and neat and flat, okay? This is a French seam. Lovely little delicate seam, okay? And then again, I've left these just clipped, don't tie anything. This is definitely one of those seams where later you'll go back and you say, how did I do this? And it's kind of nice to be able to unravel one side and kind of remember, oh yeah, that's how I assemble this, okay? So French seam, pressed neatly, all ready to go.